For those who are just coming in, we are just giving a couple more minutes as folks join. I want to let you know that we are recording this session, so we'll be able to send it out to you afterwards in either English or in Spanish. And we're also live streaming on Cultural Survival's Facebook page and YouTube page. And we'll be posting it as well on our website, cs.org, afterwards. We have interpretation available in Spanish. Si usted desea escuchar la presentación en español, se puede hacerlo haciendo clic en el globo del icono en la parte inferior de la pantalla. And we will be having question and answers at the end of the presentation, but feel free to use the Q&A function if you have questions on clarity as we're going through the event. Okay, looks like we've got a good group of folks here. Thank you all for joining us today. I think we can get started. We have a really great training on the agenda for you. So excited to share that with you. I hope you all have been getting a lot out of the permanent forum this year if you've been attending side events or listening into the plenary sessions. It's great to have you all here, and we're feeling grateful for the way this virtual format has opened up participation from those who wouldn't have been able to fly across the country to New York or fly across the world to get to New York this week. For anybody who's not familiar with Cultural Survival, I want to share a little bit about what we do and introduce our work. So Cultural Survival is an Indigenous-led organization based in the US, and we have staff in 10 countries around the world. We are just about to celebrate our 50th anniversary this year, working towards our mission, which is to advocate for Indigenous people's rights and support Indigenous communities, self-determination, cultures, and political resilience. So one focus of Cultural Survival's work has been advocating for Indigenous rights implementation in countries around the world by making use of UN mechanisms that we're going to be talking about today. And a brief introduction on that, human rights are measured through the UN conventions and covenants, as well as the Universal Periodic Review process, which you may hear use the acronym here today, UPR. Regular reviews of different member states monitor how rights are enshrined in these treaties or declarations are being implemented. And the review of every nation offers a chance to educate citizens and demand the realization of the rights enshrined in the different treaties that are ratified by governments. So Indigenous people's involvement is essential in this process to seek justice through these different review mechanisms. One of our goals at Cultural Survival is that Indigenous rights are included in these different evaluations that are usually talking about human rights broadly, and we want to make sure that Indigenous rights are brought into these conversations. So in partnership with local Indigenous organizations, we submit reports to treaty body committees and the Human Rights Council. Cultural Survival has been working on UPR reports, Universal Periodic Review reports, since 2005 during the first cycle. And our reports detail about how state governments are violating the rights of Indigenous peoples in light of their commitments in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, where you can see that, and the other treaty bodies. We offer recommendations for improvements on how to implement these rights. And we've submitted a little bit over 100 reports, which you can reference at our website, cs.org/reports. I want to introduce Josh Cooper, who we are lucky to have with us today, who's going to explain how your organizations can start engaging in this process and make your advocacy more effective. So I will introduce Josh Cooper here. He is an academic, advocate, author, analyst, and activist based in Hawaii. He currently serves as Dean of the Global Leadership Academy for Human Rights Advocacy in Geneva, Switzerland. Josh holds positions of Senior Global Advocacy Manager, Senior Director of Communications and Community Engagement, Senior Director of Global Governance and International Initiatives, Senior Director of Research Policy and Law with multiple people's movements, NGOs, human rights defenders associations. Josh is a human rights advocate engaging in global and regional mechanisms guaranteeing fundamental freedoms. He's participated in as an official observer at the United Nations meetings in both the charter and treaty bodies of the human rights machinery for over a decade. He also assists in diplomacy engagement on climate change and sustainable development. So as you can imagine from that bio, he also doesn't get much sleep. And it's about 6 a.m. for Josh in Hawaii. So hopefully we can bear with him as he's waking up. And before I hand it over to Josh, I just want to make sure, I want to let everyone know that there's going to be some acronyms that we'll be using here. As any of you will surely know, if you've done work at the UN, there's a little bit of alphabet soup in the work we do here. So we're going to post a list of different acronyms that may come up in the chat box for your reference. But if there's anything that you are confused about or need clarity on, feel free to ask that in the Q&A feature as we're going. And you can ask questions in either English or in Spanish. And with that, I will hand it over to Josh.
Aloha, thank you so much. Aloha kakakiaka, it's good morning here from Hawaii. It's an honor to be with everyone at the 20th Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. And what a great day to begin Mother Earth Day. We'll be discussing the UN mechanisms, beginning with the Universal Periodic Review. And then we'll discuss some of the other processes that are available, such as the UN Human Rights Treaty Body. And we'll touch a bit upon the UN Human Rights Council and also the UN High-Level Political Forum. And that will be what we'll try to look at this morning. So I hope everyone's doing well. We can put in the chat where you're from around the world, if that sounds good. And we will try to touch upon the experiences that you would like us to share. So we really do appreciate you joining us this morning on this journey for justice. And we'll begin with the Universal Periodic Review. The Universal Periodic Review is a process that allows for beautiful activism and bold advocacy, creating a multi-pronged, peoples-centered approach covering community to country and global civil society. The UPR really promises a refreshing, proactive, and participatory political approach to reinvigorate our public policy rooted in human rights. So it's really one of the most exciting processes that I think exist at the UN. And one of the most important aspects why I would say such a thing is it also is on a schedule. We actually know the calendar for the next 5 years, and we're just about to wrap up the 3rd cycle. So if you've participated in the past, you've been able to see the entire process, and we sort of break it down into 5 stages. The first stage is preparation. Second stage is interaction. Third phase is actually the consideration, the 3.5-hour review. Fourth phase then is the adoption, and that happens a little bit later, and that's at the UN Human Rights Council. And the 5th phase is implementation. And so the exciting thing is you can organize and take your issue through each phase and are able to then engage, I would say, at 3 levels for every one of those 5 phases. First, at the community level, where human rights matters most. You got to bring human rights home and share what is possible with the UN Universal Periodic Review. But also, since the UPR is so inclusive, it allows you to also teach about everything else that exists at the UN, because the UPR actually looks at all of those recommendations that have been issued in the past and allows you to be able to connect to that. So that's sort of exciting. The second aspect, besides at the community level, is at the capital. And if it's safe, you can organize in your capital and be able to connect with federal officials or national cabinets and ministers, as well as parliaments, Congress. But you can also connect with the other governments because they would be your partner in the UPR. So you can reach out to embassies, you can go to also New York, or you can look at that 3rd level, the global civil society in Geneva and New York, where you reach out to the UN missions. And so the exciting thing is it goes from being able to, we really, if we're doing the UPR well, we're really good, especially if you're here at the Permanent Forum, at naming and shaming. We're able to highlight the human rights violations and demand that the practices of the government that are abusive and harming Indigenous peoples cease. But the other aspect that's exciting, and we can see that as well emerging over the 2 decades at the Permanent Forum is also framing and claiming our rights. So we can frame and claim and be able to make sure that we change the situation on the ground and really draft the public policy that must change. And it's really in two ways. One, of course, is to end a current practice that's extremely detrimental to the dignity and fundamental freedoms of Indigenous peoples. Or two, point out a good policy that Indigenous peoples have been able to initiate and then be able to then implement and improve it and say how we could actually make it better if there were resources from one of the UN agencies, or if you could actually see how there could be more partnerships among Indigenous peoples, as well as NGOs and allies and advocates around the world. So the UPR is an amazing opportunity to really look at all of the human rights that exist. And this is why I think the UPR is important. In that first phase of preparation, if you're looking at that, I would say there's really three C's. You can collect, you can compile, and you can clamor. So the first thing we do in the first phase of the UPR and the preparation phase is actually educate. It's a chance to reach out to all of the Indigenous peoples, as well as all your allies across the country, and say, what is the Universal Periodic Review? And more importantly, what are human rights? And so the UPR, what makes it so engaging is that it's so expansive. You can actually cover everything, and I'll give you the whole field. Number one, anything in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So we know when the world met in 1945 in San Francisco, that human rights and self-determination were mentioned 7 times. So you can bring up self-determination to determine one's political destiny, to pursue economic, social, and cultural development based on one's own Indigenous values. Absolutely essential. So that, of course, is Common Article 1 of the Twin Covenants of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and that International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, but also Article 3 of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So you can use anything from the UN Charter. Number 2, anything from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UDHR. So UDHR has civil and political rights, but also economic, social, and cultural rights. So what's really good, such as the situation in the United States, when we're organizing here in Hawaii due to colonization, as well as the over 500 nations across the US, is the US has not ratified the Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights. So this is our chance to bring up economic, social, and cultural rights. And that is very important. That is the right to housing, the right to healthcare, the right to education. And of course, all that relates to land. So it's a really great chance to talk about economic, social, and cultural rights, as well as civil and political rights. And then it's anything your government has ratified. And the exciting part is there's 9 core human rights treaties, and they cover all the issues that we talk about. I just talked about the Twin Covenants on civil and political rights and economic, social, and cultural rights. But there's also CEDAW for women's rights. There's also CAT, which is a small animal, but also in this case, the Convention Against Torture. There's also the Convention on the Rights of the Child. There's also, very importantly, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. There's a Convention on Migrant Workers. There's a Convention on Enforced Disappearances. And there's the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So the exciting thing is anything your government has ratified of those 9, you could reinforce those recommendations that were made and once again remind that your government hasn't taken any action. And then besides that, anything the UN Human Rights Council has done looking at your country. So that could be in a couple of ways. It could be that the High Commissioner for Human Rights has mentioned your nation during agenda items 1 or 2 in either of the 3 annual meetings that take place around the Human Rights Council, which take place, the biggest one for 4 weeks in February and March, the summer one in June or July, or the September session, which many Indigenous people go to, because that's absolutely important. That's where the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples resolution is adopted, but also the special rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous peoples. So that September session also meets, and that's another chance for those 3 weeks. that if anything was mentioned by the High Commission for Human Rights, you can speak there. But we also know, looking at those 3 sessions of the Human Rights Council, that's also where the special procedures participate. Those 44 thematic special procedures, including independent experts, working groups consisting of 5 experts from across the 5 regions of the UN, and the special rapporteurs, which many of us are pleased to have just participated with in the PFII. And it's a chance to be able to see if they have either done a country visit. Every special procedure is allowed 2 country visits per year, but they also write thematic reports on themes. And that's a chance where they might have also mentioned a bad practice by your government or a good practice by Indigenous peoples to actually be able to accomplish the human rights issue they're exploring in that thematic report. Then there's also UN agencies, programs, and funds. And that's the exciting part, of course, about the permanent forum. We all miss not being able to be walking through the halls of the UN headquarters, which you could have seen earlier in the back of Danielle. But also all those UN agencies, programs, and funds are situated around New York. So as you're walking from where you're staying, or you're walking from a different side event, you'd be able to see all those different UN agencies, and you can talk about anything those UN agencies, the resident coordinators, have said about your country. And one of the other exciting things is you can even bring up international humanitarian law. And we know there's a lot of situations that we're very concerned about of what's going on and different actions of violence that take place. And there was, of course, just unfortunately one more killing in Colombia of an indigenous woman, just actually even today as we're meeting. So the exciting part about the UPR is you can bring in anything. So you can explain that to everyone, and it's your one chance to tell everybody about all the mechanisms of the UN. So that's sort of exciting, is that in that preparation phase, you can describe everything that's there. Now, one of the most important things really that you accomplish in the preparation phase is you get to issue a stakeholder report. And the stakeholder report is really a 5-page document if you're an individual. So everyone here participating can write a 5-page document and be able to actually have that on the UN High Commission for Human Rights website. And so you can do that. But another thing, what we've done when we organize, as Cultural Survival shared, over 100 different UPR stakeholder submissions, you can also be part of a larger either thematic report or even a country report that goes up to 10 pages. So one of the exciting things and how we usually organize is we are there speaking and meeting with Indigenous people and submitting a report just specifically on the Indigenous rights and making sure that the world knows about exactly what we want to share, highlighting that. But then we also make sure that we focus on thematic issues because all of human rights is so interconnected, and the intersectionality of specific rights is a way that we can feature how, with the Earth Day situation, how climate justice related to racial justice is related to land rights. It allows us to really extend and share all those different aspects. And then, of course, the exciting part is making sure that the national report that's submitted includes Indigenous people's rights. So that's the first phase. You write a 5-page or you contribute to a 10-page document where you're able to reinforce those important rights that you really want to share and bring to the global attention. And so it's really organizing at your community level. At the Capitol, you can start networking with other NGOs across the country, but then also to even network with those larger NGOs, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Cultural Survival, to then say, hey, please include us, let's network and see how all of the issues that they're featuring in their annual reports and the work that they do are also making sure that the directly impacted people are speaking directly with their truth to power and sharing their stories with the world. The second phase is interaction. And this is very exciting. I call it the collaborate, coordinate, and communicate phase. This is where really we take the reports that we wrote, those 5-page, 10-pagers, and what's exciting is we boil it down to 2 pages. And the 2-pager really is, in a way, what you share and how we communicate throughout this UPR process. And what you include in that is what is the issue? Link it to one of the articles of the human rights treaties we talked about, or the UN Declaration, or even the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And what you do there is you say, this is the human rights violation that is being violated. The second part is you really get into the question, what did you always want to ask the government that maybe they haven't answered, or it'd be very difficult to put that question to them? And the final one is your recommendation. What specific action do you propose that would remedy the human rights violation, or more importantly, actually be able to amplify action to be able to ensure that the rights are realized? And so in this phase, what is really important is we get to reach out to the embassies. If we have a country where it's friendly in the capital and there's no really reprisals taking place, we can organize and go to the country level into our capitals and host events with the embassies or commissions. Or you can go to New York, such as the Permanent Forum, and that's something that we usually do. Around the Permanent Forum, we look at what UPRs are coming up. We look at which ones are going to be taking place in May, right after the Permanent Forum, and what other ones are happening in October, November, towards the end of the year. So it's a chance also while you're in New York at this Permanent Forum to host a side event and say, this is our UPR. And that's a chance then not to go to New York just for the Permanent Forum and give your intervention and host side events, but actually plan and prepare for the next phase, that universal periodic review. And we've been able to organize dozens of those throughout the, since 2008, when the Universal Periodic Review was created. And so in this phase, I also consider it sort of a shopping for states, or picking out the most positive countries who have been champions of specific rights. And the best way to do that is really through the UPR info website. If you go to the UPR info website, you can actually look at all the recommendations, and you can type up an issue. You can say Indigenous peoples, you can say women's rights, you can put in whatever topic or theme that you are focusing on, and then it'll give a list of all the recommendations and questions, all the recommendations ever given by a country. So then that allows you to say, oh, I'm focusing on women's rights. Let's reach out to Norway. I'm focusing on Indigenous. Let's talk to Mexico. Let's talk to Guatemala. And so that's a chance to really reach out. Another place that you can also look to sort of decide on states is there's all those resolutions adopted at the Human Rights Council. This is your chance to also reach out and talk to those states that sponsor those resolutions. Say, will you make a recommendation at the UPR and support the position we've made? And so that interaction, I said you can do it at the Permanent Forum. Another thing is you can do it at the UN Human Rights Council sessions, that February, March, that June, July, or that September session. And one of those things is we actually called it the Serpentine Sessions, this time with the virtual. But we always, if you're in Geneva, you can actually walk up to one of the desks where the governments are based and say, hi, we noticed you've been a champion on Indigenous rights or on this specific theme. We'd very much like to share with you information from directly impacted peoples with the latest situation so that you could then make a great question or recommendation during the upcoming UPR. Many states would be excited to meet with you because they know in a way what we know. We are the experts because we are the ones dealing with these issues on a daily basis. And we know the specific situation on the ground that the governments might be aware of certain issues they care about, but there's no way they can know what you know by living the lives that you've lived. So they are very eager to engage, and they really do appreciate the expertise that you have. And even during the COVID crisis, we've held Serpentine Sessions. And in those Serpentine Sessions, one of the exciting things is we actually did a virtual room with Mont Blanc in the background, and like we were in the Serpentine Session, the cafe, and then we would meet with different governments. And we hosted dozens of these. And then it was good. We met for a half an hour and shared with them so we could even overcome the distance. So if we don't have a lot of funds and you can't even go to Geneva, this COVID crisis has allowed us to be even more imaginative and creative on how we engage. So that's the exciting part. And that really leads up right until the UPR. And so you collaborate with many partners, you coordinate your position and make sure it gets into the hands of many governments who are champions, and then you communicate what rights you really want. And the third phase is the consideration. And the consideration is the actual 3-hour plus review of your country that takes place in Geneva, in the Palais des Nations. And so there we connect, we contact, and we circulate. And one of the exciting things is what you really do is you have your 1 to 2 pager, but this is your final chance. And what you're able to do is then reach out to those governments one final time. And it's a 2-week process, the UPR. And in those 2 weeks, roughly 14 countries are reviewed. So you could host a side event, such as the one we're all engaging in today. And you can then speak one last time to the governments, sharing the information directly from the front lines, sharing the most important imminent issue and bring it to the international arena right there. So many governments love to meet with civil society because it's their last chance to get information on 2 ways. Either if they haven't done all their homework, but they want to have the latest, or one, if they want the updates from what's been happening so that they can share that and include it in their intervention that they make. And then for 3.5 hours, the exciting thing is everyone's watching the review and everyone then gets to see if all the work they've done, really, it can go from 2 years to 18 months to just a couple of months prior. You get to see how effective you were. You get to see if your question or recommendation is asked. So the good news about the UPR, you know if you were successful or not, because you will then hear the words that you've shared, that recommendation that you drafted, that you know specifically will actually change the conditions on the ground. You will then hear that said, and you might hear the government respond as well in that first 3.5 hour session. So that's what's so exciting, is you get to see the results. And either you can do that, of course, in Geneva at the UPR, and the High Commission for Human Rights has funds to obtain to do that, or you can also have a big viewing party in the capital, sort of the way they do for, rugby World Cup in the Pacific and Oceania, or football, soccer, and we saw that big reaction just this week. It's like the amazing Super League for civil society. You can host video conferences and be able to watch your government get grilled in a way that's making a state. And for me, it's a breakfast sandwich, but for you, a lunch sandwich that you'd be picking up at the Vienna Cafe, one of those side events we'd be going to. And so Cultural Survival always has the healthiest snacks, so it's a good space to go for your side events if you're at the UN in the future. And so you're able to then share those specific recommendations and see the governments take those in that 3.5 hour review. And if you can't be there in Geneva, you can watch it in your capital, but you can also set it up, these viewing parties, in your community. And those have been exciting. We've had them big screens up and then everybody's out there watching them. And it's exciting because you can see people say, that's my question, that's my recommendation, that's exactly what I was trying to say that the government has ignored. This is exciting. So that's that phase. And then it gets to the exciting part. You have really roughly 4 months. In those 4 months, you get hundreds of recommendations. It's exciting because then there's the 3 C's of claiming, categorizing, and corresponding. And so in a way, what you do then is it allows you to then reach out. And we did new campaigns this time. We did a 4-week campaign where we first talked to our local city officials and state officials and said, will you implement these recommendations? So we talked to city councils and we talked to state legislatures in the House and Senate. And we said, would you look at these recommendations? We even did a resolution in the Hawaii State Senate to say they would adopt and actually implement the recommendations of the UPR. So you can see a lot more happening at the local level with the Sustainable Development Goals, but also with human rights. There's really a bringing human rights home movement going on. There's human rights cities as well. So that's the first pace that you can concentrate on and also translate those UPR recommendations into what can be done on the ground. Second was actually looking at the Congress, looking at what can Congress do, looking at your parliamentarians, asking them to hold hearings and discussing it. Third is even talking to the cabinet and under those different hats, what are they doing? And then the last one is, of course, talking to your president, prime minister, and putting pressure there. being sort of loud and annoying, like a vehicle traveling by your house at an early hour of the morning. It allows you to really focus on that. And we did different things. We had hashtags, read my recommendation. We had hashtags, accept my recommendation in different phases. And so in this phase, it allows you, we did a lot more at all the phases that are possible, but it also allows us to prepare for the adoption, which happens at the Human Rights Council. And at the Human Rights Council, what's exciting is you can actually then speak at the Human Rights Council, because there's, in that 1 hour review, civil society, 10 NGOs get 2 minutes to speak. So in a way, we start this process with our stakeholder report and we end this process. We get the final word saying, yes, these actions are being done, or no, unfortunately, this action hasn't been included and more must be done. So it's a very exciting phase. And you can actually see your government, if they've accepted things or if they're rejecting things, they'll give an indication of that at the adoption. And so it's exciting to then participate in that phase. And then I'd say the final phase is really what matters most. It's bringing human rights home. And that is really implementation. And in that phase, what we sort of look at is we converse, we share the results of what happened at the UPR, we confirm what our rights are, and we cognize, and more importantly, we create a conscious campaign of implementing those human rights recommendations. And so what's exciting is you can focus on those areas I talked about before. You can have hearings at the city councils and the county councils. You can actually have parliament hearings and briefings where you're actually talking about how nationally they can either change the constitution or pass a new law or get rid or amend an existing law. And you can also talk, like I said, to the cabinet members, those departments of housing, health, those departments of labor, all those different avenues you can then promote, which we haven't done enough of, but it's a new space. And then of course, finally, to put pressure on those elected officials to say, you must actually follow up on those promises and pledges. So that is the UPR, very briefly, but it's to share that with you. And the exciting part, like I said, is you can organize at the community, the country, and the capital, and the global civil society, and every of the one of those 5 phases. The treaty bodies are also exciting. Probably you have to look on the website and you'll be able to see, as well as you could go to DOCIP, and they would then say which countries are being reviewed. So the treaty bodies are those 9 core treaty bodies. They exist with experts. So experts actually review the reports and actually discuss and meet with those governments. So that's the difference between the Human Rights Council, where it's governments who might be champions for human rights, with experts who are there to implement those specific conventions. And so I would say there's the same 5 phases, which is good, that it's preparation, interaction, actual consideration, adoption, and implementation. The only difference is we're concentrating on these experts and their specific convention or covenant. And what's exciting is these experts know human rights. They know very well their convention, but they have the same problem with the UPR where there's 14 reviews. They have at least up to 7 to a dozen being reviewed every time. And what those committees do is they meet 3 times a year and review dozens of countries at each process. So this is a chance for you to actually drill specifically on specific human rights issues, racial discrimination, women, torture, looking at civil and political rights, economic, social, cultural rights, migrant working rights, enforced disappearances, children's rights. And children's rights, of course, is important because the Convention on the Rights of the Child has Articles 17, 29, and 30 relating to Indigenous Peoples' rights. It's the most inclusive of the 9 core treaties. And so the exciting thing is we get to meet with those experts and discuss things with them. So you prepare a shadow report or a stakeholder report, just like in the UPR. You submit that to the High Commissioner for Human Rights. During the intervention phase, you have that 1 to 2 pager again, where you reach out and discuss and talk with, in this case, the experts. And the committees exist with really up to 10, all the way up to 23 experts. So you can discuss things with them. And this is a time to reach out. You can sort of research them. We used to make sort of baseball or football cards soccer cards of all the experts so that you know what issue they care about, and then you can reach out to them. The other exciting part about that interaction phase is there's even at the opening sessions a chance where you get to speak briefly and talk at that meeting and say what you really care about the most and what they should share. And you also have a briefing right immediately prior to the review of a country. And these reviews are exciting. They are 5 hours long or 6 hours long, so almost double the UPR. So you can really get details and focus. And then they have an adoption only 2 weeks really at the end of their sessions. And then implementation, of course, is doing all that at home. So that's exciting. And the latest place that's really important for all of our work is the Sustainable Development Goals. We know those were adopted in 2015. Many of us were at the Rio Plus 20 Summit, and we know there were only 5 then, but that we really participated through the Indigenous Peoples Major Group, and we're able to push for up to 17 goals. And many of us are aware of those. They're really human rights light in many ways, but that's, you know, ending hunger, zero poverty, good health and well-being, quality education, gender justice, clean water and sanitation, renewable energy, decent work and economic growth, looking at those important issues of innovation infrastructure, reducing inequalities, looking at at sustainable cities and communities, then looking at responsible consumption, what Indigenous peoples have always practiced with their cosmology and belief systems, and then it's climate action, life below water, life on land, peace, justice, and strong institutions, SDG 16, which we're concentrating on today, and of course 17 is partnerships. And what's important is there is actually a review process. So what happens on is a high-level political forum, and that's a chance for us then to do exactly what we sort of do. And you usually get roughly a year notice. At the July session, the year before, countries start pledging they will be agreeing to a voluntary national review, a VNR. And so that actually happens every July, and it's a shorter review. It's a 20-minute if it's a repeat time that they've been reviewed, or it's a 30-minute review. But you can actually speak there under the Indigenous Peoples Major Group, but you can also share your recommendations with states. So you can actually go through all the processes. But this high-level political forum, countries agreed to do a voluntary national review. And so that's exciting. And since today's Earth Day, we'll add a little bit extra. And we really appreciate you coming in. We know that the United States, President Joe Biden, and you saw the first Indigenous woman cabinet member in the history of the United States, Deb Haaland, who's the Secretary of Interior, speak earlier. But what's exciting is you can actually push and promote all of these sustainable development goals, but even more so if you're excited about sustainable development goals, the Paris Agreement. And so there's a summit, and we knew Hindu, who's one of the permanent forum members, actually spoke yesterday, but today 40 governments have gathered and the US is launching its NDC, Nationally Determined Contribution. So it's actually talking about how the Paris Agreement, which includes Indigenous rights, which has a local community Indigenous peoples platform, but these NDCs are what governments are saying doing to decarbonize, which also really focus on decolonize. And it allows you to then demand what you care about. And at the next COP in Glasgow, which will happen November 1st through 12th, you can then say, if you're going to meet that, you'd actually have to respect our rights and do these things, because you know we're the ones protecting the forest. And we're the ones that actually ensure that there is no improper development that desecrates Mother Earth. So the NDCs is a whole new process, and many countries are declaring, especially the United States today, but you can follow this and look at it through the Paris Agreement. So that's a little extra bonus, and it's really an honor to meet with everyone today. And I'll stop now, and that allows us to have ample time for questions and answers. And I look forward to continue to partner. My email's pretty simple. I'll put that in the chat box. And we're more than welcome at Cultural Survival to help and assist you through the Universal Periodic Review, through the Voluntary National Review, through the Nationally Determined Contributions, through the treaty bodies, and even a rapporteur visit. Cultural Survival does amazing work at all those levels so that you can understand and be able to really share your stories and share your specific strategies with improving human rights and ensuring that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is actually implemented. So mahalo nui. Thank you so much for spending your morning or lunch with us. And we look forward to engage with you today and going into the future.
Thank you so much, Josh. It was really wonderful to hear all of that. It's great to see so much energy and excitement about these processes. And it's really true that, you know, we can participate in these. I think sometimes people see the UN stuff as being really distant from us who are, you know, working on the ground, and it doesn't have to be the case. There's all these opportunities for folks to participate and hold our governments accountable to what they commit to do. And that's a really crucial piece in making all this work, is the accountability aspect. So thank you so much for sharing all of that. We want to open it up to questions. So if anybody has a question for Josh, we have some more time here. Feel free to write them in the chat, or you can raise your hand. Let's see. Marcella, I see a question from you. I will open it up and let you ask your question. You should be able to unmute.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Joshua. Very neat and important information. My question is, I'm an Indigenous woman from Mexico, and we have 500 years of resistance trying to have recognition as Indigenous people of the Americas, First People. For first time, actually, the Federal Highways has recognized us as Native American. I just saw it like a month ago. That is the first time. But there is so many definitions among the federal, you know, when you go to the SBA, doesn't have the same definition. So basically it's like having a check with no funds. And so the Treaty of Recognition of Indigenous People needs to be landed at home, meaning, you know, in the Americas, because we have not been recognized. And the confusion of being among the Hispanic group, it really hurts. It has hurt the Indigenous people of the Americas forever. So I have done a lot of policy with construction and other things, business oriented. And I created a nonprofit organization for Indigenous people, so I can hopefully help with some of the stuff and also healing in arts and protection of arts and language. But what would you suggest in terms of recognition of the Indigenous Mesoamerican people or American to have literally recognition and not having this confusion between Hispanic and Latino and all that, but actually having the Indigenous recognition among the Native American in the US? Thank you.
So thank you so much for your question. So I would say it's definitely an important issue, and it's not only a question of the Americas. I've been helping with the Kampuchea Khmer Krom, and they've been always trying to be categorized by the government as ethnic minorities, yet they've always been living on their indigenous ancestral homelands. So it's a common challenge. So one of the first things we do is always at the permanent forum, always at the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples, when we take the floor, is actually speak and share and make sure that the government recognizes as Indigenous people. We know many countries love to talk about Indigenous rights everywhere else, but then not in their own homeland. So we know a couple of years ago, China said, we care so much about Indigenous rights, but we have no Indigenous peoples. And it was like, whoa, you know, that's just making almost like, you know, Marvel film, just evaporating so many millions of Indigenous peoples from the face of the earth. So it is important to always demand to be recognized as Indigenous peoples and to make that clarification between minority and Indigenous, as it's been, you know, documented and clarified through those multiple declarations and forums that exist at the UN. The other side is also working with the InterAmerican Commission and also the Court of Human Rights. Those are important tools that you can access as well on the regional level. And I would say that's an important one to coordinate at. And then sound like you're working on both sides in Mexico, but also in US. And Mexico just actually hosted the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the Mexico City Council, to implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So that's a new angle as well. And that's welcome, because then it also at least finally recognizes the inherent dignity of Indigenous peoples, as you said, being there since time immemorial, and not in a way being some migratory group that doesn't have rights or being classified as another segment of society. So I'd say those are a couple new ways that you can engage in the Inter-American regional system, but then also going down to the city level has also been important. And many people have also changed their Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day in October. And those are ways to commemorate, as well as commemorating the September adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, September 13th, or even Indigenous Peoples Day on August 9th, commemorating when Indigenous peoples first went to the UN in Geneva. So I think those are ways that you can push and demand the promotion and protection of Indigenous rights. The other question I see is about working for Indigenous communities of Bangladesh. So that's been already mentioned by the chair of the Permanent Fora, Chair Norgam from the Sami people in Finland. And what is important is when Bangladesh agrees on the Sustainable Development Goals, that's what's really crucial. Every country agreed to the Sustainable Development Goals, all those 17 goals, which include really economic, social, and cultural rights, fair economy, climate justice, and then human rights and partnership. What's important is two main phrases that came out of the world we want. Number one, leave no one behind. So the countries are supposed to make sure no one is left behind, and that allows us then to push and demand justice, and usually Indigenous peoples having their rights violated. Second is furthest behind first, meaning that the countries can't do what they did on the Millennium Development Goals. What they really need to do is they have to focus on furthest behind first to make sure that they're making sure that no one is left behind and that everyone's rights are respected, especially those who have been denied those human rights the longest. So that really puts Indigenous peoples in a space. And then we can check if Bangladesh is going this summer or the next summer. It's usually every 2 to 4 summers, people get reviewed there. So that's one way we can do it. We got an Indigenous PhD student in philosophy working. So what articles are committee? Maybe you could share maybe where you're from. I could help out a little bit more. But what's important if you look at there's also a convention on genocide. So convention on genocide has 5 elements. And the important thing is you don't have to prove violation of all 5, just one of those 5. Governments are pretty concerned about using the G word. So cultural genocide is a great way to frame that for sure. But you can actually use it everywhere. So we just were talking yesterday before Earth Day to prepare for the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the nationally determined contributions, and pointing how Indigenous knowledge is absolutely essential if they're going to ever achieve the Paris Agreement of striving towards 1.5. And we know 1.5 is essential to stay alive, because if it's not done, then we know Pacific Island countries, their right of self-determination will really be denied under an invisible wave of colonization of carbon that then has sea level rise, and then seeing their ancestral lands go under the ocean. So, you know, it's really important that you can raise it there. And the exciting thing is the Pacific expert under the Local Communities Indigenous Peoples platform, she actually majored in religion at university, and then brought up Kananoa, the god of the ocean. And she shares that perspective when she's doing her work on protecting the ocean and translating it into what the West is using as marine protected areas, which is something that has always existed in Indigenous. You always are protecting the areas. You always make sure at certain times you can't fish, because you have to make sure the fish are replenished. Because if you ever deplete and destroy and make something extinct, you know you would then not have those resources going into the future. So it's already part of the Indigenous cosmology. So I could say we could actually participate at every model and everything that I've shared, from the UPR to the treaty bodies, to the Human Rights Council, to Sustainable Development Goals and the VNR. You could participate. And I'll give you one example, is under the Convention Against Torture, we actually pushed that denying people, Indigenous peoples, access to their land, or removing them from their land, was tantamount to torture because of that spiritual connection to the Aina, to the earth. And so that was what we did to even expand those traditional definitions of those treaty bodies to then include an Indigenous perspective. So hopefully that helps there, but thank you so much for that question. And I know we have around 10 minutes left, so we'll definitely answer all the questions you have. And like I said, I gave my email so we can also meet and discuss and talk in the future as well.
We have a question from Christian, so I'm going to allow Christian to unmute, and you can ask that question.
Yeah, hi. How you can hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Oh, great. So I'm Chris, CEO of US-based nonprofit Baigali, but originally from Russia. So part of our work is with the Russian indigenous communities, like Buryat people in the Republic of Buryatia. So I got just short advice for our South American friends about recognition of indigenous community. By the Russian law, for example, big community, like a lot of thousands of people, for example, couldn't be indicated by like indigenous people. It's just a stupid law, I know, but just for example. And when we got trouble with Mongolian hydropower plants near our border, we tried to use this indigenous group to solve the problem, to make everybody know that indigenous people are under the danger because of these dams. So, okay, in Russian law, it's a big group, so they couldn't be indigenous group. But by the World Bank rules, they could be indigenous people, and we use it this way to stop these dams, because the World Bank gave money to Mongolia for this project. So my short advice is about, okay, if your country doesn't allow your small group to be indigenous, of course it's not okay, but for example, you can try to research stakeholders rules. Maybe it will work. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So yeah, it is important that you can leverage when other places recognize Indigenous peoples. At the World Bank, it was a lot of hard work to make sure that they had an Indigenous peoples policy, to make sure that they include Indigenous peoples' rights. So yeah, even if your government challenges it, it's great that you're organizing in Russia, because we know it's a very difficult space to organize in, and we know Ripon and many Indigenous peoples have been able to demand and include Indigenous rights in their advocacy. So thank you so much for sharing. And we know that's important too, is the solidarity between Indigenous peoples to work with one another and coordinate together.
I'd just like to add one point, Christian. Our Cultural Survival's Executive Director, Galina Angarova, is also Buryat from Russia. So it would be great to reach out. Perhaps we can talk further. It's something that we're definitely aware of, the problem of the lack of Indigenous people's ability to self-determine as Indigenous in Russia, with that artificial capping at 50,000 people. So we'd love to talk more about that, and I'll put in my email so we can be in touch.
Yeah, and that's what many countries have done. They love having the blood quantum theory, and it all was to then make sure that Indigenous people statistically would be eliminated so that they could have access to the land. So many countries are doing that. And yeah, I would definitely say the executive director, Galina, is an amazing advocate, and you have a really good partner there with Cultural Survival. So please reach out to them. So if anyone has any more questions, you can just
It looks like we have one more question in Spanish. Let me read that. A comment, Indigenous children do not have access to education. and often don't have opportunities for work. Do you want to talk a little bit about the CRC in response to that, Josh?
Sure. So there's the important thing is we can actually look at a lot of examples. So an exciting front is, of course, it's Indigenous education as well, right? You don't want to just have the colonizers' language. So UNESCO is a really good UN agency to reach out to. The other aspect is the Convention on the Rights of the Child is definitely where education exists. And it also says it must be in mother tongue. So that's very powerful. And even future generations issues. 5 youth, a couple from Oceania in the Pacific, actually signed up together to actually do an individual petition under the optional protocol 3, allowing for individual petitions to actually demand the rights to make sure their human rights aren't denied. So they did that under climate change. And education is also, though, in many of the other treaties, so you can bring it up there during those country reviews, but also looking at it's 4, SDG number 4, you can also bring it up under the high level political forum and education there as well. And what Indigenous have done also is try to take control of their own education and set up their own schools. And that's where then language can be taught and perpetuated. And for, like I mentioned earlier, the Khmer Krom group, they actually do their programs in schools, in temples, which are their cultural centers. So if the state doesn't do what it should, then they're coming together, and then it actually grows the community and gets everybody organizing and getting stronger as well. So, and we all know that children aren't only the future, but they're the present. So it's really a way also to engage youth in the process. And we're doing a Model United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous issues on Friday and Saturday as part of the Permanent Forum 20th. And, you know, that's a great way as well that students learn in the role play, and they're able then to participate in the actual Permanent Forum and even get involved with the Youth Caucus.
We are just about at the end of our time. If there's any final questions, anyone can, oh, we've got a couple more here. How do we get our youth involved in the Model Permanent Forum? I don't know if is there a Model Permanent Forum?
Yeah, we're doing one this year. You can just email me if you want to. I put it in the chat box, joshuacooperhawaii@gmail.com. And you can register and just put on there you heard about it at the Permanent Forum, and you'll be able to participate for free.
Wonderful.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for being with us today, Josh, and for everybody who has tuned in. It's great to see folks who are interested in getting further engaged. We will have the recording sent around to everyone who registered, and it will also be available on the Cultural Survival Facebook page just right immediately after this, since it's live streaming there. So you can access that and be in touch with us at Cultural Survival. And would also like to say, if you appreciated this space and you'd like to contribute to Cultural Survival, you can do so at cs.org/donate. And as always, thank you so much to Josh for being here and hosting this with us. It's always a pleasure to have you, and we hope to see you again someday in person.
Me too. Mahalo nui. Hui ho.
Mahalo. Thank you, everyone.